So I'm going to show you how to recreate this, and then you can decide if you want to recreate it exactly or you want to do something similar using different shapes or whatnot. So you can see there that it's moving. The surface is actually moving. So what I'm using is I've used a Mograph cloner and a random effector like we talked about in the lecture. And up here what I'm doing is I'm using the Mograph cloner as a surface mode, and I'm applying the clones to the surface, and then I'm using the random effector to actually move that surface using the random mode noise. So you can see here that that is what's creating this sort of waving, um, undulating movement that's happening with my cloner. So I'm going to show you how to recreate this. Okay, so I'm going to go up here and I'm going to get myself a platonic. Okay, and here's my platonic. I'm going to leave it alone for now. I'm not going to change any of the settings. Okay, so this is what I'm going to use as the object that I want to attach my clones to. So to do that, I now need to get a cloner. Okay, and then I also need the object that I want to attach to this. So I'm going to get myself a cylinder. Keep it simple. Okay, so I'm going to go and I'm going to resize this a little bit now. Not too much because I'll be adjusting it after the fact anyway. So I have my cloner object, and I'm going to temporarily hide the platonic so that we're just looking at the cloner. Okay, and so here's my cylinder, and I would like to clone this. So to do that, I have the cloner object. I need to make this the parent, and the cylinder is going to be a child of the cloner object. Okay, so now you can see that we talked about these in the Mograph lecture that I just went over, but we have different modes in here. The default is linear, so you can see here that you can see it's working. I can make all these copies, and if I make it smaller, you'll see now you can see the space between them. I could also adjust the offset and whatnot. So that's linear. Then we have obviously radial is for a circle based series of clones, and then you have the two arrays down here that are go in X and Y. Grid array does Z. So these are very particular looks, and then sort of the, I don't want to say the odd man out, but you have the object mode, which is going to allow you to feed any sort of object into the cloner to use as a base. And the clones are going to be able to apply themselves to that object. So you could use a primitive, or you could use something that you made with your model modes, up to you. Okay, so I'm going to switch to object mode. Okay, and nothing's going to happen until you feed something into the object field down here. Okay, so that's what you do is you go up here, and I'm going to turn my platonic back on, and I'm going to take it and drag it and drop it into the object field. Okay, and then you'll see that it works. And what's going to happen is all the clones are going to be laid out across the surface randomly. This is because the distribution here is set to surface. That's the default. So you can switch this, and we will switch this for this purpose. I want to put it on edges because I'm creating this sort of cage-like look out of this shape. So I want to run all of these tubes along the edges. Okay, but you do have more than just the surface choice. You have vertex, which are the points. You have edges. You have the polygons themselves. Surface. Volume is the interior. And then you have axis. I went over these in the Mograph lecture, so hopefully these are starting to sound familiar. So I'm going to choose edge. Okay, and you can see there they are, lined up in the middle of each edge. They're a little short, so I can go up here to my cylinder, and right now I can just resize them. So I'm going to go to make sure the cylinder is selected, and I'm just going to, actually I'm not going to resize them with the scale tool. I'm just going to go to the cylinder object itself, and I'm going to make the radius smaller, and I'm going to pump up the height. I don't want them to overshoot too much like this. I just want them to touch enough so that I don't have a big gap here, but I obviously don't want them to overlap too much where they're going in different directions. So I've upped the height, and then the radius I'm going to put on 2. Maybe 3. I'll keep it on 3. Changed my mind. Okay, so now what I have is I have the cloner with the cylinder. Okay, the cloner is set to object mode. The platonic has been set inside the cloner object menu, and that is how the cylinder is able to apply itself to the edges of the platonic. Okay, I have it object mode, distribution is edge, and then I resize my cylinder to fit the object that it is cloning to. Okay, so far so good. Not too difficult to set up, and now you've got this interesting look here where I've got this border detail happening, this raised border on my platonic. Okay, and obviously that doesn't take too much effort to do that. Okay, so now I want to think about animating it. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to get myself a random effector, which again we went over in the lecture. And you use the random effector frequently. It's one of those things whenever you need to generate random values, the programs are really good at that kind of thing. Humans not so much. Programs great. Okay, so I've got my random effector, and what I showed you in the lecture was I had applied the random effector to the cloner. Okay, so I'm going to show you that first, and you can see the difference between what I had done previously and what I'm doing in this exercise. So if I go to the cloner and I go to the effectors tab, I can drop the random effector in there. Okay, and you can see what happens is all of the cylinders move. They've all come off the shape. They're around where they were originally located, but they've all moved. Okay, so they're not attached to the surface anymore. Okay, now if I wanted to introduce some random animation, I could use, again, this is something that should be hopefully sounding familiar because it's from the previous lecture. I can go to the effectors tab and I can change the random mode to noise. Okay, and this will give me a perpetual animation for the random effector. Okay, and you can see that the cylinders are moving around. Again, they're close to their original locations, but they're not attached to the platonic surface anymore, and that's not what we want. So making the random effector affect the cloner object is not what our goal is here. If we think about it, we don't want the clones to move necessarily. We want the surface to move, and the clone should move with the surface because they're attached to each other. So I'm going to take the random effector off of the cloner. So I'm going to go to cloner object, effector, take off the random, okay? And what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to take the random effector and I'm going to make it a child of the platonic, okay? And you'll see that nothing happened, so you might be thinking, okay, that didn't work, okay? But the reason it didn't work is because the random effector doesn't know to actually affect the platonic. We do have to change a setting to make that work. So if we come down to the random effector settings, right now I'm in the effector setting, and I can see here that I've got random mode noise on, which is okay. That's what I want because I do want, again, I do want perpetual animation from the beginning. So what I'm going to do is actually I'm going to go over to this new tab, the Deformer tab. And you can essentially get this random effector to work like a deformer would. I can get it to affect the actual parts of this object as opposed to um, the object as a whole. So you can see that deformation is off. If I open this, you can see that I have some options. I have object, point, and polygon. Okay, so if I choose object, and I go back to the start, you'll see that the whole thing wobbles. Okay, which is obviously different than what we saw when the random effector was applied to the cloner. We saw that each one of those clones was individually being affected by the random effector. Here you can see that's actually what's being affected is the platonic itself, the whole object. That's what's being affected by the random values. You can see now I'm getting a little wobble here as the whole object moves. Okay, so it's generally most of what we've done is in place, but we actually want to see the shape deforming. So obviously the shape is staying pretty intact here, so object's not the choice. So instead I'm going to go one down, and here's point. And I'm going to pause it for a second. Ignore that these cylinders don't seem to be resizing themselves. Right now they're not, but just pay attention to the shape itself. So to make this less confusing, I'm actually going to turn off the cylinders for now so you can see just the shape itself. Okay, so you can see that what's actually happening now is deformation is set to point, so the random effector is able to actually go and apply the random positional data to each of the points and move them around. So obviously that is what I had done previously. Now this is moving faster, and I can change. I'll show you how to change the speed. But this now is deforming the actual shape, not using a deformer, but using a random effector to have this deformation-like quality. Okay, so this is point, and the other option you have is in here is polygon. You can see that it will do the same thing. It will move the shape around, but instead of moving by point, it's moving by polygon. So it has a different look because obviously the polygons here are a lot bigger than the points, and they're also fewer polygons than there are points. So it's moving, in this case, it's moving a little slower and maybe a little bit more wobbly. Whereas when you compare it to the point, okay, it's definitely a lot more movement happening, a lot faster. I don't know if I would say it's more or less wobbly, but this one definitely is got a more sort of springy quality to it. Okay, so this is the one we're going to use. Now, this is going faster than the example I had showed you. You can change the speed. Obviously, it's not here because there's only one option here. You have to go back to the effector tab. And then where you have random mode noise, if you go a little farther down, you'll see animation speed. It's on 100%. If you do like something like 10%, it will be a lot slower. Okay, and definitely doesn't look like a wobble anymore. Now it's got more of a floaty quality to it. Okay, or you could speed it up, and you can certainly go past 100%. This is what 200% would look like. Okay, a lot happening. Okay, so I'm going to put mine to 25%. See what that looks like. Okay, and I like the way that looks. Okay, and so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to pause it and turn my cylinder back on. Okay, and you'll see that my cylinders, they are moving with the surface, but they're not quite matched up anymore. It's a little bit messy because some are too short and some are too long. So I'll show you now how to fix that. Okay, so I have to come over here to back to my cloner, and you can see that the problem I have right now is that the tubing that I'm creating is no longer nicely fit to the platonic. And as the platonic is moving around, the cylinders are moving as well. They're still connected to the edges, but they're all different sizes. And that's because they're set to the original size, but the surface is changing size, and the cloners don't actually know how to do that or are unable to do that. So it's a quick fix. You just come down here to the cloner options again. You go down here to the bottom, distribution edge, go a little bit farther down, and there's an option called scale on edge. And I'm going to check that on. And you can see when I check that on, all of a sudden they all resize and they are 50% and they're in the center. You have to make this edge scale 100%. Okay, and now they will all stretch themselves to be the full length of the edge. This is great because now when you go and press play and you have the random noise going and generating the different size for the edges for the surface as it's moving, the edges are going to readjust themselves because now they're set to be 100%. So if it gets longer or shorter, the cylinder is going to react correctly. So if I go back to 0, now I do want to point this out. Sometimes you're going to see that the cloner lags or the effectors lag, or you change something and it doesn't seem to update. When you hit play, it should right itself. If it doesn't, you could also turn everything off and turn it all back on, and that should kick it back into gear. Okay, a lot of times when we go back to 0, it doesn't know until it starts playing for the random noise to kick in. So it does need to start playing so that it corrects itself. All right, so now that's what it's looking like. So very happy. I've got my clones. They are aligned to the edges. They are fitting perfectly from end to end. So as the surface is moving now, the edges are moving with it, and it's nice and seamless. If you do not want to have the platonic actually there, or whatever shape you end up using, but if you don't actually want the surface to be seen, you can just turn that off, and then you will just have the cage left behind in this case. So that is a choice as well. Okay, but what I want to do is light it, texture it, have it look nice. You could do 3-point lighting, you use a physical sky, you could do a black background and a floor, whatever you feel like. But when you're done with this, we want it to look nice. You can have a little animation there. I have 90 seconds. I think, not 90 seconds, but 90 frames. So that comes out to 3 seconds. So I think that's a good sort of benchmark to look towards. And this will be obviously written on the blackboard. Okay, and then if you wanted to go a little farther with it, you could have as many clones as you want on your object. So if I wanted to have like something to punctuate each of the points, I could definitely do the same thing again. I could have a cloner, and I could get myself a say I grab a sphere and make it super tiny, and I clone the sphere, and I go and I do the same thing. I go to object mode and I drop the platonic into the object mode there and make it sit on the vertex instead this time. Okay, and then maybe I'll make it a little bit bigger. Okay, so now I got a little sphere that's sitting on the tip of every point. Okay, which is a fun look as well. All right, so that's the general idea. So at this point now, you guys can go and experiment with it yourself. So again, you can feel free to recreate this, okay, and then texture and light it, render a video, at least 3 seconds. Or you can take the same concept as long as you use a Mograph cloner and you use a random effector and you clone that you use that Mograph cloner to clone some objects onto the surface of another object, you're good to go. So feel free to get as creative as you want. But definitely this is where you should start. So at least you're going to recreate this, or you're gonna push forward and sort of do your own version of it. If you have any questions, let me know. This will be our first exercise, and then we'll have another one that will involve text.